It had been 3 years since my father vanished, no calls, no birthday cards, nothing but a hollow silence. Then one morning, a letter slid under my apartment door. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in his familiar, sharp handwriting. Inside was a single, cryptic page, and something small taped to the back that made my hands begin to shake. By the time I understood what it truly meant, it was already too late to pretend I hadn't seen it. My name is Clara Monroe. I am 32 years old, and my life is a monument to precision and order. I live in a glass and steel apartment tower that pierces the crisp Denver sky, a place where the lines are clean and the views are uncluttered. By profession, I am an internal auditor for a major financial firm, a job that suits my temperament perfectly. I spend my days sifting through spreadsheets and transaction logs, hunting for anomalies, for the single misplaced decimal point or the ghost transaction that signals a system in decay. I find a quiet satisfaction in reducing chaos to a set of verifiable facts. It is the only way I have learned to survive. My life is my fortress, built brick by digital brick, its walls fortified by routine and emotional distance. This fortress was constructed over the ruins of another life, a life that belonged to my father, Richard Monroe. He was a man who lived in the headlines, the brilliant, charismatic CFO of Monroe Holdings, a rival firm that had once cast a long shadow over the entire financial district. He was a titan. Until he wasn't. He became a ghost, vanishing 3 years ago in the immediate aftermath of a sprawling financial investigation. The official narrative was one of fraud, of a cornered executive who fled rather than face the music. The unofficial narratives, whispered in boardrooms and over expensive lunches, were far more creative. They spoke of offshore accounts, assumed identities, a life of quiet luxury in a country with no extradition treaty. For me, there was no narrative at all. There was only silence, a sudden violent amputation from my life, leaving a phantom limb that ached with unanswered questions. For 3 years, I have lived with that silence. It is a heavy blanket I pull over myself each day. When colleagues, in a moment of idle curiosity, would Google my last name and put the pieces together, the questions would come. They were always tentative, couched in feigned sympathy. Monroe? Any relation to Richard Monroe? My answer was always the same, a polite, sterile deflection. He was my father. I would offer no more. My tone a clear and final barricade. The conversation would wither, and they would learn, as everyone did, that the subject was closed. I did not visit his old haunts. I did not speak to his former friends. I curated my existence to be an empty space where his memory could not take root. I convinced myself this was strength. It was, in truth, a carefully managed haunting. That haunting became terrifyingly real on a Monday morning. The day began like any other, the 6 a.m. alarm, the flavorless protein shake, the walk to the office under a sky the color of slate. But when I opened my apartment door, my routine shattered. Lying on the welcome mat was not the usual collection of junk mail and catalogs, but a single, plain envelope. It was manila. The paper aged to a sickly, jaundiced yellow, soft and worn at the edges, as if it had been carried in a pocket for a long time. It had no stamp, no postmark, no return address. Just my name, Clara, written across the front. The handwriting was a jolt, an electric shock that traveled up my arm and seized the muscles in my chest. It was his, unmistakably. The sharp, decisive strokes, the slightly impatient slant of the letters. It was a script I hadn't seen in 3 years, yet it was as familiar to me as my own reflection. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, inside my apartment, with the door locked and the deadbolt thrown. I slid it open with a kitchen knife, the small act of violence feeling strangely appropriate. A single sheet of matching yellowed paper was folded inside. The message was brutally short, written in the same hand. "I'm sorry for what you'll find soon, Dad." That was it. No explanation, no sentiment beyond that cold, ambiguous apology. My mind reeled, trying to anchor the words to some kind of context, but they floated in a void. Sorry for what? What would I find? And when was soon, the word hung in the air, a threat disguised as a time frame. Taped to the back of the note with a small, neat piece of clear tape was a USB flash drive. It was a cheap, generic black plastic stick, the kind you get for free at trade shows. A small white label was affixed to it, bearing 2 words in the same stark handwriting, "Only you." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The silence of my apartment, once a comfort, now felt oppressive, thick with unspoken danger. I crept to the peephole, my breath fogging the small lens. The hallway outside was empty, a long, sterile corridor bathed in the cold, humming glow of fluorescent lights, the patterned carpet, the numbered doors, the emergency exit sign at the far end. It was all exactly as it should be, yet it all felt alien, menacing. The world had tilted on its axis. The past was not behind me. It was here, lying on my doormat, waiting. Who had placed it there? Had my father returned, a phantom creeping through the city? Or was this a message sent via a proxy? The thought that someone had stood right outside my door, just moments ago, made the skin on my neck crawl. I dropped the envelope onto my granite countertop as if it were contaminated. My training, my entire professional existence, screamed at me. An unsolicited piece of hardware was a Trojan horse, a digital plague carrier. Plugging it into any network device was an act of profound stupidity. Yet, the message was from my father, or it was meant to look like it was. The drive felt heavy in my hand, a small, dense object containing an unknown quantity of trouble. My first instinct was to destroy it, to throw it down the incinerator chute and pretend the morning had never happened, but I couldn't. Only you. The words were a hook, a command. This was meant for me. This burden was mine. I slid the USB drive into a side pocket of my work tote, the cool plastic a constant, nagging presence against my hip as I walked to the office. The city seemed different that morning. The faces of strangers felt more inscrutable. The familiar architecture of downtown Denver seemed to hide unseen watchers in its shadows. At work, I tried to lose myself in the comforting monotony of my job. I ran diagnostics, cross-referenced payment batches, and built flowcharts mapping corporate expenditures. But my focus was fractured. My mind kept returning to the letter, to the USB drive sitting in my bag like an unexploded bomb. My instinct, a gut feeling honed by years of searching for hidden deceptions, told me to wait. Do not plug it in here, not yet. The corporate network was a fishbowl. Every click, every file transfer, every device connection was logged and monitored by IT security. If this was a trap, my office was the trigger. The afternoon dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity of strained normalcy. I exchanged pleasantries with colleagues by the coffee machine, feigning interest in weekend plans and complaining about the weather. Inside, a low-frequency hum of anxiety vibrated through my bones. I felt watched, exposed. At 3:42 p.m., the alert popped up on my screen. It was a system-wide bulletin from our internal media relations department, the kind that usually announced new hires or quarterly earnings previews. The headline was a string of bland corporate jargon, but a single word caught my eye, a name that had no business being on my company's internal server, Monroe. My blood ran cold. I clicked the link, my hand unsteady on the mouse. The bulletin was a short, terse memo. It was a syndicated news brief from a major financial wire service, distributed internally as relevant market intelligence. For immediate release, the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) has officially announced the reopening of its investigation into the 2022 Monroe Holdings financial fraud case. Citing new, undisclosed evidence, federal investigators will re-examine the circumstances surrounding the firm's collapse and the disappearance of its former CFO, Richard Monroe. Sources close to the investigation suggest that key evidence, previously thought to be destroyed or inaccessible, may have recently surfaced. I read the paragraph 3 times, the words blurring and sharpening. It was here. This was it. This was the soon. The letter was not a memory. It was a prelude. My father, or someone acting in his name, had known this was coming, The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. The news story was the context, and the USB drive in my bag was the content. The silence had been broken not by a whisper, but by the distant thunder of a federal investigation, and I was standing at the epicenter, holding the lightning in my hand. I work at Altura Capital. This is not just a statement of employment. It is the punchline to a cruel, cosmic joke that has been 3 years in the making. I sit in a cubicle on the 42nd floor, in the heart of their compliance department, a sentinel paid to guard the ethical gates of the very company my father had tried to burn to the ground. Before he disappeared, Richard Monroe's final public act was to formally accuse the board of Altura Capital of systemic, multi-year securities fraud. He claimed they were running a phantom accounting scheme, creating billions in paper assets to inflate their stock price before a planned acquisition. Altura's response was swift and brutal. They countersued for defamation and industrial espionage, painting him as a disgruntled, unstable competitor fabricating lies to sabotage a rival. They leaked selected portions of his personal financial records to the press. They won the public relations war in a matter of weeks. When the SEC investigation into Monroe Holdings was announced and my father vanished, Altura Capital released a sanctimonious statement about the importance of integrity in the marketplace. And then, a year later, they hired me. I remember the final interview with the head of human resources, a woman with a helmet of lacquered hair and a smile that was a masterpiece of corporate insincerity. My resume was impeccable, my qualifications beyond reproach, but the specter of my father filled the room, an unacknowledged third party to the conversation. I had waited for the question, rehearsed my detached, professional answer, but it never came directly. Instead, as she extended the offer letter across the polished mahogany desk, she looked me in the eye and said, "At Altura, we admire loyalty and discretion above all else. Ms. Monroe, we find they are the cornerstones of a successful career." At the time, I registered it as a compliment, an affirmation that they saw me as my own person, capable of professional integrity despite my family name. I accepted it as a testament to my ability to overcome the stain of my father's legacy. Now, sitting at my desk with the news of the reopened SEC investigation burning on my screen, her words echoed back to me with an entirely different resonance. It wasn't a compliment. It was a condition. It was a leash. Within the compliance department, I am an island. The team is a tight-knit ecosystem of professional alliances and mentorships. Everyone has a sponsor, a senior executive who plucked them from a business school or a competing firm and guided their ascent. Their careers have been curated. They lunch with vice presidents and play golf on weekends with division heads. I am the only one who came in through the front door, a digital application submitted into the void. I have no patron, no internal champion. My existence is a matter of administrative record, not personal investment. This has made me both invisible and hypervisible. I am overlooked for high-profile projects, yet I sense that my work is scrutinized with a unique intensity, as if they are constantly waiting for the flaw, for the genetic inheritance of my father's alleged corruption to manifest in a rounding error or a missed deadline. My direct superior is Evan Pierce. He is 5 years my junior, a fact he seems to enjoy, and he holds the title of Senior Compliance Manager. He is a product of the modern corporate machine, a man who understands that perception is more valuable than performance. He is handsome in a generic, forgettable way, with teeth that are too white and a handshake that is too firm. He speaks in a fluid stream of business jargon and motivational quotes, but his eyes are perpetually cold, constantly scanning, assessing, and calculating. He is a master of the subtle manipulation, the backhanded compliment, the strategically placed rumor. His grasp of complex financial instruments is average at best, but his understanding of human weakness is profound. He treats me with a kind of predatory familiarity, a professional courtesy that is always sharpened with a cutting edge. He has a favorite joke, one he deploys whenever I am within earshot of others, usually by the coffee station or in the moments before a team meeting begins. He'll lean against the counter, stirring his black coffee, and fix me with a knowing smirk. "Clara," he'll say, his voice pitched just loud enough for the group to hear, working hard, or hardly working, just make sure you document everything. Wouldn't want history to repeat itself. Maybe fraud runs in your family. Eh? He always delivers it with a light, teasing tone, as if it's an inside joke between the two of us. And every time, the small circle of colleagues around him offers up a few seconds of uncomfortable, sycophantic laughter. And every time, I force a thin, brittle smile onto my face. I'll be sure to keep meticulous records. Evan, I'll reply, my voice even and cool. I let the smile linger for a moment too long, holding his gaze until he is the first to look away. But inside, I am a scribe, carving every syllable of his condescension into the walls of my memory, every smirk, every casual cruelty, every patronizing glance. I have recorded them all. The question of my employment has been a constant, low-grade hum in the back of my mind for 2 years. Why hire me? Why bring the daughter of your sworn enemy, the man you publicly branded a criminal, into the inner sanctum of your operations? It made no sense from a risk management perspective. I was a liability, a potential Trojan horse. I had rationalized it in a dozen different ways. Perhaps it was a public relations move, a demonstration of their magnanimity. See, we are so confident in our innocence that we can employ Richard Monroe's own daughter. Perhaps they believed it was the ultimate power play, a way to own a piece of their vanquished foe, to hold me as a living trophy of their victory. Or perhaps, as I most often concluded, it was simple arrogance. They were so secure in their position, so certain that the past was buried, that they simply didn't care. They saw me as a non-threat, a broken piece from a shattered dynasty, useful for my skills, but ultimately powerless. Now that question was no longer a philosophical puzzle. It was a sharp, terrifying blade pressed against my throat, the letter resting in my purse, the USB drive nestled beside it. The SEC announcement they rearranged the entire mosaic of my life at Altura Capital. What I had interpreted as arrogance now looked like calculated surveillance. My isolation wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of office politics. It was a deliberate strategy of containment. Evan's taunts weren't just the casual bullying of an insecure manager. They were probes, little tests designed to gauge my reaction, to see if any of my father's defiance still flickered within me. They hadn't hired me in spite of who my father was. They had hired me because of it. They had brought me into the fold to watch me, to control the narrative, to ensure that any lingering embers of my father's crusade would be extinguished before they could catch fire. I was a listening post, a canary in their coal mine. If anyone from my father's old world tried to contact me, they would be the first to know. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass of my monitor. The woman looking back was a stranger, a fool who had mistaken her cage for a fortress. I had spent 3 years building a life on the assumption that my father's story was over. I see now that it never was. I was wrong to think he fled the game. He wasn't a king who had been checked and fled the board. He was a grandmaster who had sacrificed a major piece in a calculated gambit, a long play that was only now beginning to unfold. The letter wasn't just a message, it was his next move, sent from the silence, from beyond the grave, or from some hidden exile. And he hadn't just sent it to me, he had sent it to his enemy, delivered by my hand, right into the heart of their own castle. My employment here wasn't a joke or an irony, it was a strategy. I was his agent, his ghost in the machine, and until this morning, I hadn't even known it. The silence was over, and I had a sickening feeling that everything, all of it, was only just beginning. The walk home was a journey through a foreign country I had once called my city. The familiar skyscrapers seemed to lean in, their glass facades reflecting a distorted, paranoid version of me. Every passing stranger, every face behind the wheel of a car, was a potential observer. The USB drive in my tote bag was a physical weight, a dense knot of gravity that pulled my entire world out of alignment. My apartment, once my sanctuary of sterile order, felt different the moment I stepped inside. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. The air was thick with the residue of a ghost's visit. I locked the door, engaged the deadbolt, and slid the chain across. It felt like a pathetically inadequate defense against the kind of trouble that had just been hand-delivered to my door. I didn't reach for my sleek, modern work laptop. That machine was a direct link to the corporate panopticon, a device I no longer trusted. Instead, I went to the back of my hall closet and pulled out a dusty, forgotten piece of my own history. It was a 5-year-old laptop, a heavy, clunky machine from my college days. Its battery was long dead, and it hadn't been connected to the internet in at least 4 years. It was, for all intents and purposes, a digital island, completely air-gapped from the world. I plugged it in, and the machine whirred to life with a noisy, protesting groan, its fan kicking on like a small, asthmatic engine. The screen flickered, illuminating my face in the dim light of the living room with the familiar blue glow of an outdated operating system. It was perfect. My hands were surprisingly steady as I slid the black plastic USB drive into the port. The click it made seating itself was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. A small window popped up on the screen. The primitive graphics, a relic from another era. The drive contained a single item, a folder. Its name was typed in stark, impersonal capital letters, A.M. Project. My auditor's mind immediately began to break down the acronym. Altura Monroe. The irony was so bitter it almost tasted like acid. I double-clicked. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a virus or a single threatening document. It was an archive, a library of damnation. There were hundreds of files, meticulously organized into subfolders by date and transaction type. It was a complete shadow ledger of a massive criminal enterprise. There were Excel spreadsheets, their names clinical strings of numbers and project codes. I opened one at random. It was a sea of data. Thousands of rows detailing wire transfers, currency swaps, and asset acquisitions. The numbers were staggering, far beyond the scope of any normal corporate activity. But what made the hair on my arms stand up was the column of routing numbers. They were all directed to a single, repeating entity, a bank in the Cayman Islands I had never heard of. There were scanned contracts, dozens of them, dense with boilerplate legal language. They outlined agreements between Altura Capital and a constellation of shell corporations with impossibly bland names like Global Asset Logistics and Strategic Market Ventures. The signatures on Altura's side were from senior executives, names I recognized. The signatures for the shell companies were unreadable scribbles, belonging to phantom directors of phantom companies. And then there were the emails, hundreds and hundreds of them, exported into text files. They were conversations between Altura's executive board and the managers of this Cayman entity. The language was clipped, professional, and opaque, a coded dialect of corporate speak. They talked about mitigating tax exposure and optimizing asset allocation. But reading between the lines, I saw the clear architecture of a massive money laundering and fraud operation. It was exactly what my father had accused them of, but laid bare in their own words, on their own letterhead. This was the proof. This was the evidence he never got to present. I spent what felt like hours scrolling through the digital wreckage, a cold dread mixing with a strange, fierce sense of vindication. This was his life's work, not his career at Monroe Holdings, but this obsessive, dangerous compilation of his enemy's sins. As I reached the bottom of the file list, I saw it, tucked away at the end of the archive, with a file name that was completely different from the sterile, numerical names of the others. It was a single video file, simply named For Clara. My heart stopped. I clicked on it. The screen went black for a moment, and then an image resolved itself out of the pixels. It was my father. The sight of him was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. This was not the powerful, confident Richard Monroe from the cover of financial magazines. This was a man broken by the fight. He was sitting in what looked like a cheap, anonymous hotel room. The lighting was terrible, casting deep, harsh shadows across his face. He was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched taut over his cheekbones. His eyes, once sharp and full of life, were sunken into dark, bruised-looking hollows. He wore a simple, dark sweater, and he stared directly into the camera lens, as if he could see me across the gulf of time and circumstance. When he spoke, His voice was a dry, weary rasp, a ghost of the commanding tone I remembered. "Clara," he began, and he had to stop to clear his throat. "Clara, if you're watching this, it means I failed. It means they won. At least, for now." He managed a weak, sad smile. They were always better at the game than I was. I played by the rules, their rules, and they just rewrote them whenever they felt like it. Everything in this drive, this is the truth. It's their whole rotten machine, every gear, every cog. I thought I could bring it to the light myself. But they were too fast, too ruthless. They buried me under lies before I could bury them in facts. He leaned closer to the camera, and his eyes seemed to plead with me. "I don't know what your life is like now. I'm sorry I had to disappear. It was the only way to make sure they didn't find this, to make sure it was safe until the time was right. I'm sorry for the silence." A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. "But you can finish it, Clara. You're smarter than me. You're more careful. You see the details I always missed. You can turn the tables. You know how to read their maps, how to follow their money. Don't trust the authorities. Not at first. They have people everywhere. You have to be sure. You have to be certain before you make your move." He paused, gathering his strength. "And you have to be careful, especially of E.P. He was the snake in the garden. He was the one who put us all in the ground." He looked away from the camera for a moment, his gaze distant, lost in a painful memory. Then he looked back, his expression hardening. "This is a terrible thing to ask of you. It's a burden I never should have passed on. But you were the only one I could trust. Only you." The video ended abruptly, cutting to black, leaving me in the silent, flickering glow of the empty screen. I sat there, motionless, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the room. My father's last words echoed in the silence. E.P. The initials hung in the air, a final, cryptic clue. My mind, trained to find patterns, to connect disparate pieces of information, began to cycle through the names in the files, the executives at Altura, and then it hit me. A jolt so powerful it felt like my heart had been shocked back to life. Evan Pierce. A sound escaped my lips, a strange, choked gasp that was half a sob and half a laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror and incandescent rage. Evan Pierce, the smirking, condescending child who lorded his petty authority over me, the man who made jokes about my family's legacy of fraud. He wasn't just a mid-level manager. He wasn't a useful idiot. He was the snake. He was the architect. The man my father had warned me about was the one signing my performance reviews. They hadn't just hired me to watch me. They had given me to him, a final, triumphant insult, a spoil of war. I pushed back from the table, my legs shaking. The grief that had threatened to drown me just moments before was receding, replaced by something else, something cold and hard and clear as ice. My father was wrong. He hadn't left me a burden. He had left me a weapon and a target. He had given me a roadmap and pointed me directly at the man who had destroyed our family. He thought he was apologizing for his failure. He wasn't. He was giving me my mission. I looked at the files still open on the laptop screen, at the labyrinth of numbers and contracts. It was no longer an overwhelming mess of data. It was an arsenal, and I knew exactly how to use it. A cold, quiet certainty settled over me. The authorities could wait. The press could wait. This was personal. I would not hand this data over to anyone, not until I understood every transaction, every email, every lie. Not until I had followed the map my father had left me all the way to its conclusion. I was going to dismantle their machine, piece by bloody piece, and I was going to start with Evan Pierce. The night was a sleepless, feverish marathon of data analysis. With my old offline laptop as my command center, I dissected my father's legacy. I cross-referenced the spreadsheets with the scanned contracts, matching transaction codes to clauses buried in legal jargon. I built a timeline from the email metadata, watching the conspiracy unfold in a series of clipped, coded messages. It was a masterpiece of corporate crime, elegant, complex, and utterly depraved. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through my blinds, I was no longer just my father's daughter. I was his student, his avenger. I had his map, and I now understood its language. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. I showered, the hot water doing little to warm the ice that had formed in my veins, and prepared for war. I arrived at the office at my usual time, a mask of calm professionalism cemented in place. But the moment my work computer booted up, I saw it. An email from the IT department, sent at 7:00 a.m. to all employees. The subject line was innocuous, policy update on-site device security. My eyes scanned the bland corporate prose, the talk of enhancing digital hygiene and proactive threat mitigation, and then I found the sentence that made my blood freeze. Effective immediately, as part of this enhanced security protocol, the IT department will be conducting random physical device scans to ensure compliance with company hardware policies. Random, the word was a lie. A thin veil of bureaucratic neutrality draped over a targeted attack. There was nothing random about this. This was for me. They knew, or at least suspected, that I had received something. Perhaps they had my apartment under surveillance. Perhaps the letter had been a test, a piece of bait, and they were now checking the trap. They were looking for the USB drive. They were coming for it. My mind raced, a high-speed game of chess playing out in a matter of seconds. I couldn't leave the drive at home. If they were watching my apartment, they might break in and search it. I couldn't carry it loosely in my bag. They could demand to search my belongings. I needed to hide it in plain sight, in something so mundane it would be completely invisible. My gaze fell on the row of disposable coffee cups on my desk. An idea, cold and precise, took shape. I took a clean, empty paper cup and its plastic lid, with a small piece of tape from my dispenser. I carefully affixed the USB drive to the inside bottom of the cup. Then I snapped the lid on firmly. It looked, for all the world, like an empty cup waiting to be thrown away. I placed it in the outer pocket of my trench coat, which I hung on the coat rack by my cubicle. It was a gamble, but it felt safer than any alternative. The morning air in the office was thick with a tension that was almost palpable. The usual low hum of conversation was gone, replaced by an unnatural quiet. People seemed to be avoiding my section of the floor, their eyes skittering away if they happened to meet mine. I was a leper, an infectious disease carrier. I opened an audit file on my screen and tried to work, my fingers moving over the keyboard, my mind 1,000 miles away, tracking the movements of every person who walked past my desk. Every time a member of the IT staff, identifiable by their polo shirts and lanyards, appeared at the end of the aisle, my heart would lurch into my throat. But the morning wore on, and nothing happened. It was a war of nerves, and they were letting me stew in my own anxiety. Just after 11 a.m., he appeared. Evan Pierce didn't walk to my desk. He materialized beside it, moving with a silent, predatory grace. He leaned against the partition of my cubicle, one arm casually draped over the top, trapping me in my chair. He was smiling, but it was a thin, predatory slash of a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Heard you've been busy, Clara," he said, his voice a low, confidential purr. It was the same tone he used for his jokes, but all traces of humor were gone. This was a different kind of performance. I didn't look up from my screen immediately. I finished typing a sentence, letting him wait, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of my immediate, fearful attention. Then I slowly turned my head, my face a carefully constructed mask of neutral inquiry. "Just another audit week." "Evan," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "You know how it is. The numbers never sleep." His smile widened. He pushed himself off the partition and took a step closer, invading my personal space. He placed his hand flat on my desk, his fingers spread wide, a gesture of casual dominance. His manicured nails were just inches from my keyboard. "Funny," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "because we've been busy too. We were running some routine checks on old dormant accounts, for security purposes, of course, and we found something interesting. An old account, set up years ago, linked to a shell corporation that did business with Monroe Holdings. It's been inactive for years, but it's under your name, Clara. I let a flicker of confusion cross my face before hardening it into an expression of controlled shock. I looked him directly in the eye. "That's impossible," I said, my voice sharp with practiced indignation. "I have no such account. It must be a mistake, or it must be identity theft." Evan let out a short, soft chuckle. It was a sound utterly devoid of mirth. "Maybe," he said, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive, cloying scent of his cologne. "Or maybe you're more like your father than you admit." He held my gaze for a long, charged moment, his eyes boring into mine, searching for a crack in my composure. Then, just as silently as he had arrived, he pushed himself back, gave a mock sympathetic shrug, and walked away. I sat there, frozen, the echo of his words hanging in the air like poison gas. My hands were trembling under the desk, so I clasped them together to still them. It was all clear now. The entire, sickening architecture of their plan. The account was a fabrication, a digital ghost they had conjured and planted in some forgotten server. It was the hook on which they planned to hang me. They had a motive, the daughter of the disgraced CFO. Seeking revenge, they had the means, my position as an internal auditor, with access to sensitive systems, and now they had their manufactured evidence, a financial link, however tenuous, back to my father's old company. They weren't just trying to find the USB drive, they were building a cage around me, bar by digital bar. They were going to frame me, just like they framed him. They would use this phantom account to accuse me of trying to sabotage Altura from the inside, perhaps of trying to funnel money out, or of planting incriminating data to help the new SEC investigation. They would discredit me completely, and in doing so, they would discredit any evidence I might possess. Richard Monroe's daughter, a bitter, vindictive criminal, just like her old man. The narrative was perfect. It was neat, tidy, and utterly damning. The SEC's reopened case would stall. Their key evidence now tainted by its association with a newly minted felon, Altura Capital would emerge from the scandal cleaner than ever, having rooted out another Monroe bent on destroying them. A cold fury washed over me, so intense it burned away the fear. They thought they had me. They thought I was a cornered, frightened animal, ready to panic and make a mistake. They were dangling the bait, expecting me to lash out, to deny everything, to perhaps even reveal that I had evidence against them. They were watching my every move, waiting for me to step on the trigger of their carefully laid trap. I took a slow, deep breath and forced my hands to relax. I turned back to my computer screen, my eyes tracing the lines of a meaningless spreadsheet. They wanted to play a game. Fine, I would play. But they were playing checkers, and my father had just taught me how to play chess. They thought this was their board, their rules. They were wrong. They thought they were the hunters, and I was the prey. Let them think that. Let them think they were winning. I would walk into their trap with my eyes wide open, and I would let them watch as I turned it into their tomb. The rest of the day was a performance. I was a model employee, diligently clicking through spreadsheets, my face a mask of placid concentration. I took my lunch at my desk. I made polite, meaningless conversation at the coffee machine. All the while, a silent, high-speed clock was ticking in my mind. Evan's threat had not been idle. It was a declaration of intent. They were building their case, which meant I had a very limited window to build mine. They had the advantage of the system, the infrastructure, the full weight of a corrupt corporation behind them. I had a ghost's USB drive and the element of surprise. I had to make it count. I stayed late, waiting until the office floor had emptied, until the only sounds were the hum of the servers and the distant moan of the cleaning crew's vacuum. The stage was set. My target was not the primary audit system I used every day. That was the public-facing ledger, the carefully manicured garden where everything was designed to look pristine. I needed the wilderness, the unrecorded back channels where the real business was done. I needed access to the Secondary Audit Archive, or SAAA. It was a high-privileged data warehouse, a digital vault where raw, unfiltered transaction data was stored for deep-level compliance checks and federal retention requirements. Access was restricted to senior partners and directors. Access, for someone at my level, was impossible. But impossibility is often just a failure of imagination. For weeks, I had been tracking the schedules of the senior compliance managers. One of them, a man named Marcus Thorne, was on a 3-week vacation, a sailing trip in the Caribbean with no internet access. He was a creature of habit, and I knew from his past IT support tickets that he was lazy with his password protocols. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one I had. I opened a secure command line interface, my fingers flying across the keyboard, the green text glowing in the dark of my cubicle. I didn't try to hack his password. Instead, I exploited a known, low-priority vulnerability in the network's internal authentication handshake, a flaw I had noted in a memo months ago that had been politely ignored by IT. I wrote a small script that would intercept the network's login request for Thorne's credentials and replace my own machine's IP address with his last known, static office IP. To the system, it would look like Marcus Thorne was logging in from his own desk, not Clara Monroe from hers. The system granted me access. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. I was in. The interface of the SAA was archaic, a text-based nightmare of directories and subfolders. There were no helpful icons or search bars here. This was a place for specialists, and it was designed to be impenetrable. But my father's drive had given me the key. I wasn't searching blindly. I was looking for a single phrase, project. I initiated the search. The system began to churn through petabytes of data, and I began the most intense 6 hours of my life. It was a digital heist, conducted in absolute silence. I wasn't just downloading files. I was performing a live, covert audit. I opened a forensic imaging program that recorded every single action I took, every command I typed, creating a verifiable, time-stamped video log of my entire session. This was crucial. It would be my proof that I discovered this data, that I didn't create or plant it myself. The first hits began to appear. Transaction logs, internal memos, budget allocations, all tagged with the AM project code, and they were a perfect one-to-one match with the files on my father's drive. The dread and vindication I felt was overwhelming. He had been telling the truth. He had the receipts. And now, so did I. As I dug deeper, I found the core of the scheme. It was a fund, siphoning off fractions of a cent from millions of legitimate transactions. A classic salami slicing technique, but on an industrial scale. The stolen fractions were funneled into a single, massive slush fund, which was then laundered through the Cayman shell corporations my father had identified. It was elegant, brilliant, and nearly untraceable from the main ledgers. But here, in the raw data of the SAA, the trail was clear. And then I found the smoking gun, a single, anomalous transaction from 18 months prior. It was a wire transfer for $4.2 million sent from the slush fund not to the Caymans, but to a Delaware-based LLC I had never heard of, EP, Strategic Solutions. Evan Pierce. My blood turned to ice. I quickly cross-referenced the LLC's registration number. The documents were public. Founder and sole proprietor, Evan Pierce. It wasn't just a kickback. It was a massive payout. He wasn't just the snake in the garden. He was a primary beneficiary of the entire criminal enterprise. He was skimming from the skimmers. This single transaction connected him, personally and irrefutably, to the heart of the fraud. I downloaded the wire confirmation, the LLC registration, every piece of the transaction's digital footprint. By 4 a.m., I had everything, a complete, verifiable record of the AM project, from its inception to the personal enrichment of my direct superior. Now, I had to build my weapons. I spent the next 2 hours creating 2 separate audit reports. The first was a work of fiction, my official findings. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, a dense, 200-page report filled with complex charts and technical jargon. It identified several significant accounting irregularities and traced them through a labyrinth of dead-end trails. It hinted at unauthorized account creation and hinted that a rogue mid-level auditor with a personal grudge might be responsible. It was the report they expected me to write if I ever found anything, a report that pointed the finger directly at a scapegoat who looked exactly like me. I saved it to my local drive, ready to be discovered. The second report was the truth. It was lean, brutal, and utterly damning. I named it Monroe's Echo. It contained everything: the executive summary of the fraud, the cross-referenced data from the SAA and my father's drive, the email chains, and a dedicated section on the $4.2 million transfer to Evan Pierce, complete with his LLC documentation. It was a corporate death sentence, packaged and delivered with an auditor's precision. I encrypted the report and its supporting evidence into a single, password-protected container file. The final step was distribution. I logged into a secure, anonymous email service I had set up years ago for a paranoid phase I went through after my father disappeared. I composed 3 identical emails. The body of the message was simple. The enclosed file contains verified evidence of systemic fraud at Altura Capital, specifically related to an internal program codenamed AM Project. The password for the encrypted container is "The Snake in the Garden." I attached the file to each. The first recipient was the public whistleblower tip line at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The second was a man named David Renner, a famously tenacious investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, who had been cautiously sympathetic to my father 3 years ago. The third, and most critical, was sent to Altura Capital's own anonymous internal compliance hotline, an address that I knew was automatically forwarded to the entire board of directors and the head of the legal department. But I did not hit send. Sending it now would expose my hand too early. They would know it was me and bury everything, including me, before the emails were even read. I needed to let their trap spring first. I needed them to make their move, to publicly accuse me. Then, and only then, would the truth have its maximum impact, arriving not as an accusation, but as a devastating counterattack. I accessed the email service's scheduling function. I set all 3 emails to be sent in exactly 72 hours, a 3-day fuse. It was long enough for them to corner me, to fire me, to call the authorities and build their false narrative, and it was short enough to ensure that the truth would detonate while the wreckage of my career was still smoking. I hit the confirm schedule button. The fuse was lit. The game was now mine. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I lived and breathed my role as the cornered employee, the frantic suspect. I made a few deliberately clumsy inquiries to the IT department about network security protocols. Calls I knew were being logged and reported directly to Evan. I was seen drinking too much coffee, my hands visibly trembling as I held the cup. I left a document on the printer, a page of generic legal advice about employee rights for someone to conveniently find. I was creating a portrait of a woman unraveling, a woman panicking because the walls were closing in, and all the while, a silent countdown timer ticked away in a server farm hundreds of miles away, the digital fuse burning closer and closer to the dynamite. The summons came on a Wednesday afternoon, less than an hour before the 72-hour mark was set to expire. It wasn't an email or a calendar invite. It was Evan himself, appearing at my cubicle, flanked by a grim-faced woman from Human Resources. He didn't speak. He simply jerked his head toward the glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall, the room colloquially known as the abattoir, where careers were ended. The entire office floor fell silent. Every head lifted, every pair of eyes followed me as I stood, smoothed my skirt, and began the long walk. I felt like a prisoner on her way to the gallows, but my heart was beating with a slow, steady, triumphant rhythm. They thought this was my execution. They had no idea it was theirs. The conference room was cold and sterile, a box of glass and steel overlooking the Denver skyline. Evan took the seat at the head of the long, polished table. The HR woman sat to his right, her hands folded neatly around a leather-bound portfolio. They left the chair at the opposite end of the table for me. It was a deliberate act of intimidation, positioning me as a subordinate being called to judgment. I sat down, placed my hands calmly on the table, and waited. Evan let the silence stretch out, a predator enjoying the final moments before the kill. He leaned forward, a thick, professionally printed report in his hands. He tapped it once on the table, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Clara," he began, his voice dripping with false solemnity, "we appear to have a problem, a significant one. An anomalous report was flagged in the system, uploaded from your terminal late Monday night. It's a very creative piece of work. I need you to explain it." I met his gaze, my expression a carefully blank canvas of polite confusion. I let a beat pass, as if I were struggling to understand. "I'm sorry, Evan," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Which report are you referring to?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. My refusal to crumble immediately was an annoyance, a slight deviation from his script. He slid the report down the polished table. It glided silently and stopped directly in front of me. "This one," he snapped, his voice losing its patient facade. I didn't open it. I simply looked at the cover. It was my fake report, the one I had designed to be found. My name was printed neatly below the title, Internal Audit Q3, Financial Discrepancies. I looked up from the report and met Evan's smug gaze. I allowed myself a small, sad sigh, as if I were a weary victim of a terrible injustice. "Ah, that," I said, my voice soft. I gave a slight nod. "It looks like someone is trying to frame me, again." The word, "again," landed with the force of a physical slap. The HR woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Evan's eyes narrowed, the pretense of professional concern vanishing, replaced by pure, venomous contempt. He leaned back in his chair and laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "Wow," he said, shaking his head in mock admiration. "You really are something. You think you're smarter than your father, don't you?" He tried to come at this company with lies and half-baked theories, and look where it got him. Now you, his little girl, try to sneak in through the back door with this pathetic little fabrication. He gestured dismissively at the report. "You thought you could plant this, create a smokescreen for the SEC, maybe throw some blame around to protect his legacy. It's a bold move, I'll give you that, but it's over." I didn't flinch. I held his gaze, my expression unreadable. Inside, my pulse was a drumbeat, counting down the final seconds. 10, 9, 8. "No, Evan," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in to hear me. "I never thought I was smarter than him. 7, 6, 5. I just knew I had to be quieter. 4, 3, 2. As if on cue. The door to the conference room opened. 2 uniformed security guards stepped inside, their faces impassive. They stood by the door, waiting. The final piece of theater. Evan's smile was triumphant. "Clara Monroe," he said, the words rolling off his tongue with relish. "Your employment at Altura Capital is terminated. Effective immediately, these gentlemen will escort you from the building. Our legal team will be in touch regarding the fraudulent documents and the unauthorized account we found in your name." The guards took a step forward. I held up a single hand, a quiet gesture that made them pause. I kept my eyes locked on Evan. 1, 0. The fuse had reached the dynamite. The world was about to change. "Before you have me escorted out," I said, my voice still quiet but now resonating with a cold, hard authority that made Evan's triumphant smile flicker, "you might want to check your inbox." He scoffed. "I don't think so. We're done here." "Are we?" I asked. "The board of directors doesn't seem to think so. They're all reading an email right about now. You should too. It's very informative. The SEC should be calling you any second." Confusion warred with arrogance on his face. The mention of the SEC, of the board, had finally pierced his armor of self-satisfaction. The HR woman was already pulling out her phone, her eyes wide with alarm, with a frustrated sigh, as if I were a gnat he had to swat away one last time. Evan pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. He swiped the screen to unlock it, his expression one of pure annoyance. I watched his face as he navigated to his email. I saw his eyes scan the screen. I saw the moment he found it. It was a beautiful thing to witness. The smugness vanished first, replaced by a flicker of confusion. His brow furrowed. He blinked, as if not quite believing what he was seeing. Then, the color began to drain from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sick-looking pallor. His hand, the one holding the phone, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. He had expected an angry email from me, a desperate, final plea. He had not expected this. His screen, angled slightly toward me, was bright. I could clearly see the new message at the top of his inbox. It wasn't from me. It was an automated message, sent from an internal, high-priority address. compliance@alturacapital.com. The distribution list was long, and I recognized the names of every single member of the board, and the subject line, stark and brutal in its clarity, was a death sentence. Subject urgent, fraudulent transactions, AIM, project, ATN SEC. Copy enclosed. He read it once, then twice. He looked up from the screen, his eyes finally meeting mine. The arrogance, the condescension, the predatory confidence, it was all gone. All that was left was the raw, primal terror of a man who had just realized that the trap he had so carefully built for someone else had just slammed shut on him. The world did not end with a bang. It ended with the silent, vibrating buzz of a dozen smartphones. In the sterile glass box of the conference room, Evan Pierce stared at his screen, his face a canvas of dawning horror. The HR woman was frantically scrolling through her own phone, her professional composure shattering into a million pieces. Even the two security guards exchanged nervous, uncertain glances. My scheduled emails had detonated with the force of a neutron bomb, leaving the building standing but vaporizing the power structure within. I stood up slowly, my chair making no sound on the thick carpet. I looked at Evan, truly looked at him, for the last time. He was no longer a predator, no longer a master of the universe. He was just a terrified man, staring into the abyss that had just opened up beneath his feet. "I believe," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence, "that my services are no longer required." I turned and walked toward the door. The security guards, their orders now hopelessly obsolete, simply stepped aside and let me pass. I didn't go back to my desk. I walked directly to the elevator, my trench coat with the coffee cup still in its pocket hanging on the rack by my cubicle. I didn't need it anymore. I pressed the down button, and as the doors slid shut, I saw the first signs of the coming storm. Senior partners were emerging from their offices, their faces pale, shouting into their phones. The carefully maintained order of the 42nd floor was beginning to fray at the edges. By the time I stepped out into the lobby, my keycard already deactivated. The first news alert was hitting the wires. I was a ghost, leaving the building just as its haunting began. The collapse was breathtakingly fast. It was a digital blitzkrieg. By the time I had walked the 10 blocks to a small, anonymous coffee shop far from the financial district, Altura Capital had officially halted trading on the New York Stock Exchange. The first 12 hours were a symphony of corporate destruction, and I had a front-row seat. I sat at a small table in the back corner, the rich smell of roasted coffee beans filling the air, and watched a financial news network on the cafe's wall-mounted television. The screen was a chaotic collage of red arrows and screaming headlines. Altura Capital, ALTC, trading halted pending news. SEC confirms active investigation into systemic fraud at financial giant. Altura stock plummets 27% in pre-market trading before halt. The talking heads were in a frenzy, their voices a cacophony of speculation and shock. They brought on experts who spoke in grave tones about firewalls, compliance failures, and a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. They mentioned the reopened investigation into Monroe Holdings, connecting the dots, hypothesizing that the new evidence had come from a source deep inside Altura itself. The narrative was taking shape, exactly as I had intended. I ordered a latte and a croissant. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot, milky coffee, the warmth spreading through my chest. On the screen, the CEO of Altura Capital appeared, his face ashen, reading a prepared statement from a teleprompter. He spoke of unsubstantiated allegations and promised full cooperation with the authorities. It was the death rattle of a once great king. While he spoke, a chyron at the bottom of the screen updated in real time. Sources claim whistleblower leaked entire shadow ledger of AM project. The stock, when it was finally allowed to resume trading in a desperate attempt to stabilize the price, did not stabilize. It nosedived. It was a bloodbath. I watched the numbers on the screen. A cascade of red. 35%. 40%. 47%. In less than a day, a titan of the financial world had lost nearly half its value, billions of dollars, erased from existence. Fortunes, careers, and legacies all turned to smoke. I took another bite of my croissant. The pastry was flaky and buttery on my tongue. The story reached its fever pitch in the late afternoon. David Renner, the journalist from the Wall Street Journal, broke his story. It was an exclusive, a bombshell that gave the scandal a face and a number. The cafe's television cut to a special report. Renner's face, serious and determined, filled the screen. And then they played the clip, the piece of evidence that would make the story go viral. It was a short, slickly produced animated graphic, a visualization of the data I had sent him. It showed the Altura Capital logo, then a complex web of transactions being siphoned off into a single, dark pool of money labeled AMM project, and then a single, thick red line shot out from the pool, ending at a box labeled EP, Strategic Solutions. Below it, in stark white letters, a figure appeared, $4,200,000. Our anonymous source, Renner's voiceover explained, has provided irrefutable proof of a $4.2 million payment from this fraudulent slush fund directly to a private company owned by Altura's senior compliance manager. Evan Pierce, this document, a state registration for the LLC, confirms Pierce as the sole owner. The graphic changed, displaying a scanned image of the LLC filing, with Evan's name highlighted in yellow. The headline went global. Anonymous insider exposes 4.2 mm fraud trail. Altura executive implicated. My name was nowhere. I was a phantom, a whisper. The news cycle had its villain, and it had its narrative. A brave, anonymous whistleblower had exposed the corruption from within, bringing down the very man hired to prevent it. I was not part of the story. I was the author, and I had written myself out of the final draft. The final act came just before dawn the next morning. I was in my apartment, watching a live news feed on my old laptop. A reporter was standing in the pre-dawn gloom outside a hyper-modern, brutally expensive-looking apartment building in a wealthy Denver suburb. And then it happened. 2 black sedans pulled up, and a half-dozen figures in dark jackets with the letters FBI emblazoned on the back emerged. They entered the building. Minutes later, they came back out, and they were not alone. Evan Pierce, no longer in his impeccably tailored suit, but in a rumpled shirt and sweatpants, was marched out in handcuffs. He tried to hide his face with his shoulder, but the camera flashes were relentless. A strobing, merciless assault. He looked small and pathetic and utterly defeated. The snake had been dragged from his garden, blinking in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. I closed the laptop. The storm was over. The city outside was quiet. I had done it. I had finished the war my father had started. A strange emptiness settled over me. There was no joy, no thrill of victory, just a profound, hollow quiet. My apartment, my fortress of solitude, had never felt more silent. On a whim, I opened the secure email client one last time. I expected it to be empty, but there was one new message. It had no sender. Just a string of random characters. The subject line was blank. I clicked on it. The message contained only 5 words. He'd be proud, R. And that was it. The dam broke. A single, hot tear slid down my cheek. Then another, and another. A ragged, tearing sob escaped my throat. The first in 3 years. I crumpled forward, my head in my hands, and I wept. I cried for my father. For the man on the video, broken and alone in a hotel room. I cried for the years of silence, for the hollow ache of his absence. I cried for the woman I had been forced to become. A cold, precise instrument of vengeance. The tears were not of sorrow, but of release, a final, purging flood of everything I had held inside for 1,000 days. The silence had been broken, and in the quiet aftermath, I could finally grieve. My father was gone. He might have been dead for years, or he might be a ghost, watching from some distant, sun-drenched shore. It didn't matter. He had left me one final lesson, the most important one of all. He had taught me how to finish what you start. He had taught me how to bring a corrupt world to its knees, not with a shout, but with a quiet, undeniable truth. He had taught me how to end it, and how to do it right. A week after the world burned, I received an invitation. It arrived not as a sterile HR email or a calendar notification, but as a physical letter, delivered by courier to my apartment. The envelope was thick, creamy cardstock, embossed with the Altura Capital logo, now a symbol of international disgrace. The letter inside was brief and formal. The remaining members of the board of directors requested my presence at an internal meeting. They were not summoning an ex-employee. They were petitioning a ghost. I chose to wear a simple, dark gray suit, an outfit that was both professional and funereal. As I walked back into the Altura Capitol building, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. The gleaming, bustling lobby of a week ago had been replaced by a hushed, anxious morgue. The security guards who had once watched me with suspicion now nodded with a kind of fearful respect. I was no longer an anonymous auditor. I was the architect of the silence, the woman who had walked out of the storm without a scratch. The boardroom was the same one where I had been fired, but the energy had been inverted. The men and women sitting around the long, polished table were the survivors, the ones who hadn't been directly implicated in the AM project, but whose careers were now hanging by a thread. They were the titans of finance I had once viewed with a mixture of awe and resentment. Now, they just looked old. The crisis had aged them a decade in a week. Their bespoke suits seemed to hang a little looser. Their confident postures had been replaced by a weary slump. They were a council of the damned, and they had invited their executioner to the table. The chairman of the board, a man named Sterling Croft, whose face was a roadmap of burst capillaries and broken promises, cleared his throat. The sound was unnervingly loud in the tense silence. "Ms. Monroe? Clara," he began, his voice a hoarse, strained whisper. "Thank you for coming. On behalf of the board, we wanted to express our gratitude." I simply inclined my head, my expression neutral, waiting. "What you did," he continued, choosing his words with agonizing care, "was expose a deep and terrible betrayal of this company's values. You rooted out a cancer." He paused, looking around the table for support from his hollow-eyed colleagues. "But more importantly, you did so with remarkable discretion. In the midst of this crisis, you chose not to engage with the media. You chose to protect the institution, to allow the process to unfold without adding to the chaos. For that, we are in your debt. You preserved what was left of this company's image." The cynicism of it was so profound it was almost beautiful. They weren't thanking me for exposing a crime. They were thanking me for not exposing them, for surgically removing the tumor of Evan Pierce while leaving the diseased body of the board intact. They were praising my silence. I allowed a small, thin smile to touch my lips. It was the first time I had smiled in this room, and I saw a few of them flinch. "I just did my job," I said. My voice was soft, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid. They could interpret the words however they wished. My job as an auditor, my job as my father's daughter. Let them wonder. Croft nodded, seizing on the ambiguity as a lifeline. Precisely. And in light of your exemplary performance and the sudden vacancy in a critical department, the board has reached a unanimous decision. We would like to offer you the role of acting director of the compliance department. The offer hung in the air. Thick and heavy, it was a poisoned chalice, a crown of thorns. They were offering me Evan's job. They wanted to put the whistleblower in charge of the henhouse. It was a brilliant, desperate move. It would be a PR masterstroke. The woman who exposed the fraud is now in charge of preventing it. It would signal to the SEC and the shareholders that they were serious about cleaning house, and they believed. I realized that it would buy my silence forever. They thought they could own me, that a title and a salary would turn me from a threat into an asset. I let the silence stretch, savoring the palpable anxiety that was radiating from every person at the table. I looked each of them in the eye, one by one. I saw fear and desperation, and a desperate hope that I would be their salvation. Finally, I turned back to Croft. "I accept," I said. A collective, almost inaudible sigh of relief went around the room, but I wasn't finished. I held up a hand to forestall their expressions of gratitude. "On one condition." Croft's face tightened. "Anything. I want full, unrestricted access to all past audit archives," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the glass wall behind them. "Everything, no redactions, no locked files, the complete, unedited history of this company's financial records, effective immediately." The relief in the room curdled into panic. Their eyes darted back and forth, a silent, frantic conversation of shared guilt. They were trapped. To refuse my request now would be an admission that there was more to hide. To agree would be to hand me the keys to every closet, every skeleton, every dirty little secret they had ever buried. They were staring at two different versions of their own destruction, and they had to choose the slower, less certain one. Croft looked at the faces of his fellow board members, and what he saw there must have been a reflection of his own terror. He turned back to me, his expression that of a man signing his own death warrant. "Agreed," he rasped. "The access is yours." 2 hours later, I was sitting in Evan Pierce's old office. It was larger than my cubicle, with a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the city he had once thought he owned. His personal effects had already been boxed up by HR, leaving a sterile, impersonal space. I sat in his expensive leather chair, in front of his oversized mahogany desk, and logged into the system. A window popped up, welcoming me Clara Monroe, acting director of compliance. I didn't open the files on the AM project. I didn't search for other ongoing frauds. I knew they were there, lurking in the dark corners of the archive, but they could wait. I navigated to a different section of the server, one reserved for board-level documentation. I used my new, unrestricted credentials to access the minutes of every board meeting for the past 5 years. My fingers moved quickly, typing in a specific date, the date the board had voted to sue my father for defamation and publicly brand him a criminal. The document appeared on my screen, a scanned PDF of the original, signed minutes. I scrolled to the bottom of the last page. There they were, the signatures, a list of names, scrawled in confident, arrogant ink: Sterling Croft, and 5 others, the men and women who had sat in that room today, offering me a promotion, the jury that had convicted my father in the court of public opinion before he ever had a chance to present his evidence. They had signed his professional death warrant, and in doing so, they had destroyed my family. I stared at the names, burning each one into my memory. I felt no rage, no fire, just a cold, crystalline sense of purpose. This was never just about Evan Pierce. He was just the loudest, most arrogant symptom of a disease that ran much, much deeper. He was the snake, but they were the garden where he was allowed to thrive. I closed the file. I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking softly. The game wasn't over. It had just been reset. I had spent 3 years living in the shadow of a letter my father had written. Now, in the quiet of my new office, with the keys to their kingdom in my hands. I began to compose the next one. It would be a different kind of letter, a series of quiet, precise audits, a string of carefully placed questions, a slow, methodical unraveling. It would not be signed with an anonymous R. When this letter was finished, it would bear my own signature, neatly and deliberately. In the bottom right-hand corner, CM. The first taste of silence after a lifetime of noise is a disorienting thing. For a week, my life had been a whirlwind of secret meetings, frantic legal consultations, and the careful navigation of a corporate landscape littered with the dead and the dying. I was the calm eye of the hurricane, the still point around which the wreckage of Altura Capital spun. I signed papers, answered questions from federal investigators with cold precision, and began the long, arduous process of rebuilding a compliance department from the ground up. I did it all with the detached efficiency of a surgeon, never once letting the mask of the acting director slip. But now, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the silence had returned. I sat at the small dining table in my apartment, the same table where I had first watched my father's ghostly image flicker to life on a laptop screen. The city outside was a distant, muted hum. The storm had passed, and I was alone with its artifacts. On the polished wood surface in front of me lay the two objects that had started it all: the cheap, black plastic USB drive and the single sheet of yellowed paper, its edges soft and frayed. I picked up the letter. The paper was fragile, and I held it with a reverence I hadn't been capable of before. I read the words, his familiar, sharp handwriting a testament to a desperate hope. "I'm sorry for what you'll find soon. Dad, I had found it. I had found the fraud, the betrayal, the man who had destroyed him. I had found the path he had laid for me, and I had walked it to its bloody, bitter end." The letter was a relic of a war that was now over. The USB drive, however, felt different. It was not an artifact. It was a weapon, currently holstered, but its power was undiminished. It was a seed. For days, I had wrestled with what to do with it, with the power I now held. I had the list of names from the old board meeting, the men who had cast the stones that started the avalanche that buried my father. I had the archives. I had the authority. I could have spent the next year of my life meticulously building cases against each of them. I could have destroyed them all, one by one, a quiet, orderly massacre of reputations and fortunes. The thought was tempting. It was a clean, satisfying ending. It was the revenge I had thought I wanted. But as I sat there, in the profound quiet of my own survival, it felt small. To destroy them would be to engage in their game. It would be another secret war, another series of vendettas. It would make me the new architect of ruin. My father had fought them on their terms and lost. I had fought them on my terms and won. But to continue the fight in that way would be to admit that their terms were the only ones that mattered. Revenge was a fire that consumed everything, including the person who lit it. I did not want to burn. I wanted to build something colder, more permanent. I wanted to build a better trap. I took out a single sheet of clean, crisp white paper from my desk, the kind of expensive, heavy bond paper that Altura used for its most official correspondence. I picked up a fine-tipped black pen. My hand was steady. I thought for a long moment, and then I began to write. My handwriting was nothing like my father's. It was neat, precise, the print of an auditor. To whoever finds this next, I wrote, "This is a key. It unlocks a history that proves two things. First, that great power can be used for great evil. Second, that even the most well-hidden secrets cannot remain buried forever. Do not let fear or ambition convince you to ignore what is hidden in the silence. The truth, once discovered, is a responsibility." I didn't sign it. The message wasn't from a person. It was a warning from a ghost, a future echo of the one I had received. I folded the note and placed it in a clean manila envelope. Then I picked up the USB drive. I peeled off the old, handwritten label that said, "Only You." I took a new label from my desk and wrote two simple words on it, for later. I affixed the new label to the drive. It was no longer a personal burden. It was an institutional memory, a dormant failsafe. I slipped the drive into the envelope with the note I had just written. I sealed it. I addressed it not to a person, but to a title compliance director, Altura Capital. One day, I would no longer be in that role. Someone new would sit in that oversized office, and history, I knew, had a tendency to repeat itself. Corruption was not an event. It was a process, a slow, creeping rot. I could not stop men from being greedy or powerful, but I could leave a loaded gun in the desk drawer for the next person who came looking for the truth. I would not pursue the old board members. Their punishment would be to live out their careers in the shadow of what I had done, forever wondering if they were next, forever looking over their shoulders, terrified of the quiet, meticulous woman in the director's office who held all their secrets. My revenge would be their unending paranoia. That was a far more fitting fate. I was not a warrior seeking more blood. I was a guardian. I would let justice, or the fear of it, grow on its own. As the afternoon sun slanted through the window, a single bright beam of light cut across the table. It illuminated my father's old letter, making the ink of his familiar handwriting stand out against the yellowed paper. It fell directly across his last message to me. I'm sorry for what you'll find soon. I looked at the words and the strange, sad apology he had offered me. He was sorry for the burden, for the pain, for the danger he had put me in. He had died, or disappeared, thinking he had failed. He had no way of knowing his last, desperate move had been a checkmate played out over 3 years of silence. I reached out and gently touched the paper. A final farewell to the ghost who had guided me through the darkness. A profound sense of peace settled over me. A quiet finality that was more satisfying than any victory. The silence in my apartment was no longer empty. It was full. I found it. Dad. I whispered into the quiet room, my voice soft but sure, and I finished it. Life found a new rhythm, a quiet cadence of order and control. I was no longer an auditor. I was an architect, redesigning the foundations of a ruined company. The days were long, filled with the methodical work of implementing new protocols, of building a culture of integrity on the ashes of deceit. I found a strange, sterile satisfaction in it. I had not just avenged the past, I was actively preventing its repetition. The ghosts of my father and Evan Pierce were locked away, and for the first time in years, the silence in my life felt like peace. The call came on a Tuesday morning, a month to the day after Evan's arrest. It was from a Detective Harding with the Denver Police Department, a name I vaguely recognized from the news reports. His voice was tired, professional, and devoid of emotion. He was calling about my father. Ms. Monroe, he said, the line crackling faintly. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. We've been working with Interpol and other international agencies, following up on some old leads regarding your father's disappearance. We were finally able to get a positive identification from a John Doe case in Portugal, from 4 years ago. I stood in the kitchen of my apartment, the phone pressed hard against my ear. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The world outside was bright and alive, but a sudden, Arctic cold was spreading through my chest. 4 years ago, I repeated, my voice a hollow echo of itself. Detective, that's not possible. That's a year before he even disappeared. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of papers shuffling. I understand this is confusing, ma'am, Harding said, his voice softening with a hint of practiced sympathy. The official report states Richard Monroe was the victim of a car accident outside of Lisbon nearly 4 years ago. It seems he was traveling under an alias. The identification was just confirmed through dental records. There's no doubt. He passed away a full year before the Monroe Holdings scandal ever broke. I sank onto a kitchen stool, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. The tiled floor felt miles away. My mind was a maelstrom, a chaotic whirl of impossible contradictions. Dead. For 4 years. It didn't make any sense. The video, the letter, the USB drive. It was all from him. It had to be. "But I have a letter," I stammered, the words feeling clumsy and foolish in my mouth. "I received a letter from him, in his handwriting, just a month ago." Another pause, this one longer, heavier. "Ms. Monroe," the detective said, his voice gentle but firm. "That's impossible. We had the note you provided to the SEC analyzed by our forensic document examiners as part of the case against Mr. Pierce. The handwriting was a forgery, a brilliant one, almost perfect, but a forgery nonetheless. Whoever sent you that letter, it wasn't your father. It was someone who wanted you to find what was on that drive. Someone who knew exactly what you would do with it." The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the granite countertop. The detective's distant voice continued to call my name, but I couldn't hear it. I was in a vacuum. The air sucked from my lungs, the world receding to a single, sharp point of unbearable clarity, a forgery. Someone wanted me to find it. I walked, as if in a trance, to my desk. I pulled open the top drawer. There it was, the manila envelope. I slid out the single sheet of yellowed paper. I had looked at it 100 times, seen it as a sacred relic, a final, desperate message from a loving father. Now, I looked at it with new eyes, the eyes of an auditor, the eyes of a fool. The aging, it was too perfect. The yellowing was uniform, without the darker, water-stained spots one would expect from a document carried for years. The creases were sharp, deliberate, not the soft, worn folds of time, and the ink, I held it up to the light. It wasn't the faded, slightly blurred ink of an old message. It was crisp, sharp, sitting perfectly on the very surface of the paper fibers, not soaked into them. It hadn't aged with the paper. It had been applied to a pre-aged prop. My breath hitched. My entire investigation, my righteous crusade, the narrative that had reshaped my life, it was all built on a lie, a carefully constructed piece of theater. My father hadn't sent me a weapon to avenge him. He had been a ghost for a year before the war even began. This was not his final move. It was someone else's first. My gaze fell to the envelope itself, the cheap manila paper I had taken for granted. I ran my thumb over the corner, where my name was written, and then I saw it. It was so small, so faint. I had never noticed it before. Tucked away in the bottom right-hand corner, integrated almost perfectly into the grain of the paper, were 2 tiny initials, pressed into the paper with a tool so fine it was almost invisible. A maker's mark. E.P. The room tilted. The floor fell away. It wasn't a clue. It was a signature, a boast, a final, silent taunt from a master manipulator. Evan Pierce. He hadn't just been the villain of my story. He had been its author. The entire horrifying scope of his plan crashed down on me. He knew the SEC was closing in, that the old investigation might be reopened. He knew there was a trail leading back to him. So he constructed the perfect defense, a preemptive strike. He didn't wait to be exposed. He orchestrated his own downfall, on his own terms. He forged the letter, using my dead father's memory as a puppet. He delivered the evidence to me himself. He knew my history, my skills, my predictable auditor's mind. He knew I would follow the trail. He built a trap for me, the phantom account, the fake report, all to discredit me when I inevitably came forward. He wanted me to be the source, the bitter, vengeful daughter, so that when he exposed me as a fraud, he would also invalidate the very real evidence I was carrying. He had tried to control everything, the crime, the investigation, the evidence, and even the avenger. It was the ultimate act of narcissistic arrogance. He was going to frame the woman who was going to expose him, using the very evidence that would condemn him as bait. But he had made one mistake, one fatal miscalculation. He had written a perfect script, with a perfect victim, but he had underestimated his protagonist. He expected me to be emotional, clumsy, predictable. He never imagined I would be quiet, that I would be patient, that I would build my own trap inside of his. He thought he was playing chess with a pawn, not realizing the pawn could see the entire board. I hadn't just followed his script, I had taken it, analyzed it, and written a better ending. I had won his game without ever knowing he was the one who had dealt the cards. A strange, cold smile spread across my face. The initial shock, the horror, the violation had all receded, replaced by a final, chilling sense of triumph. He had tried to make me a character in his story, a tragic fool he could manipulate and destroy, but in the end, his story was the one that had been consumed. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up the letter. I carried it to the stainless steel sink. I took a lighter from a drawer and flicked it on. The small flame a bright, hungry thing in the quiet room. I touched the flame to the corner of the paper. It caught immediately. The artificial aging a perfect accelerant. The paper blackened, curling into a brittle scroll as the fire consumed the forged words, the false comfort, the masterful lie. I watched the smoke, a thin gray ribbon, spiral up toward the ceiling, carrying the last ghost of the war away with it. The fire reflected in my eyes, two tiny, dancing flames. Then let him think he wrote the ending. I thought, as the last of the letter turned to ash, I rewrote it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me. I'd love to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support what I do, hit that hype button to help this story get heard by even more people.